Ricardo Roy, and I am a Dean's Ambassador for the ECU Riverside School of Public Policy. I'll be serving as your MC for today's event on economic choices for the Colorado River and its reservoirs. This seminar is part of the Water Economics and Policy Outreach activities of the ECR School of Public Policy called Water Dialogue, Getting to Know Your Water Agencies and Policymakers, which is led by Dr. Mehdi Nemati. Water policy design and implementation is a process that involves the policymakers, the agencies that apply the policy, and the public that substitute the policy. California has long been subject to many water policy interventions, opening up a dialogue among the public, the water agencies, and the policymakers would enhance the implementation and better and more effective water policies. You can learn more about the water dialogue at waterdialogue.ucr.edu. Before moving on to the presentation, I just want to cover a few notes on the format of this event. Our guest speaker will present for about 30 to 45 minutes. Afterwards, we'll open up to audience Q&A for about 15 minutes. And if you're part of the Zoom audience, please enter your questions via the Zoom webinar Q&A feature. Now let's introduce our guest speaker for today's event, Professor Jim Booker. He is an economist who has worked for almost 3 decades on the management, evaluation, and development of sustainable water use portfolios. Professor of Economics at Siena College, he has served for 8 years as department chair and is the winner of College Matthews T. Collin Award for service. He was a visiting professor and scholar at the University of Wyoming, Kalamazoo College, the University of Colorado, and with International Water Management Institute in Laos. A student of Robert A. Young at Colorado State University, his dissertation anticipated current challenges and opportunities in managing Colorado River water. His co-author publications include Water Crisis in India in the Case Research Journal, a review article in Natural Resource Modeling covering 25 years of advances in modeling of water resources. And most recently, in the Journal of American Water Resources Association, he examines water allocation over time on a climate influenced by the Colorado River. Recently relocated to the Tualatin River, watershed in Oregon, he kayaks the local waterways and explores hiking trails in his community and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Professor Booker to the stage.
Thank you, Ricardo. Generous introduction. I want to start by just thanking Professor Nemati for the invitation to speak here at UCR. This is my first visit to the beautiful campus here, and it's just delightful. You even welcomed somebody coming from wetter climes with a little bit of rain for me today. So I appreciate that. I also want to give a call out to Professor Schwabe, who worked with one of my students, one of my undergraduate students. I see lots of you in the audience here, together with Professor Nemati, on an interview and research project last spring that led to this talk here today, the invitation for that. It's really the power of network. Reach out to anybody that you know, that your professors know, that you can talk to, because it's not going to help just you, it's going to help whoever you make contact with as well. So I'm very grateful to my student, Jasper Paez, who's just a second-year student in political science and economics right now, and has really made this opportunity for me to be here today as well. And just one last call out to Professor Ariel Dinar, who I've had the pleasure of working not alongside, but in parallel with in a variety of ways, and his encouragement and thoughtful insights throughout my career in the area of water economics. Well, today is really going to be a journey along the Colorado, and it's been a journey in my personal life as well. I just wanted to share a little bit. Siena College is located in upstate New York, in between New York City and Montreal, about halfway in between. I've spent a little over 20 years primarily in an undergraduate institution there, but have recently relocated to just south of Portland, Oregon. I'm on quite a trip at that point. You should know that I started my life in the East, in upstate New York. I moved west, and then east, and then west, and then east, and then most recently to the Pacific Northwest. So just like the river has a long journey from Wyoming and Colorado down to California and then Mexico, our lives also have quite the journeys. We'll find also as we go through today that the institutions that lay out how we use the waters of the Colorado also probably have some serious journeys ahead of them as well. I will get right to what the conclusions of some of my hard research are from the very beginning and just laying out the outline of what I'm going to cover more formally before I go ahead and look at what is in blue there that is going to tell us and offer an opportunity for discussion about what we might be doing for the future on how to address a world that is going to have lower flows in the Colorado River. We'll get to how I come to the conclusions in red in the first part of my talk here. I'm going to start near the headwaters. I'm going to be cheating in lots of ways with this slide right here. I personally took this picture this summer. You're looking at Knife Point Glacier in the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming. That happens to be on the eastern slope, so all that glacial water is going to the Atlantic Ocean, not to the Pacific. But if you look through the pass that is there, that's Indian Pass, and on the other side, you are very close to the headwaters of the Green, which I call, because of my past living in Wyoming, the headwaters of the Colorado, because it's longer if you go that direction. It's not more water, but it's longer. So I have a place in my heart for that location. Well, looking ahead to what the future is going to be, that's my first topic right here. This is really the hydrology of what we can expect for the inflows coming from those headwaters regions, because those headwater regions with all the snow are really where it's at for the water. The place, I'm an economist, I don't work directly with where the estimates and the climate comes from on climate and the role of precipitation and temperature, but working from Udall and Overpeck on their WRR article most recently on trying to understand the 2020 drought, the 20-year drought since about the turn of the century, and then looking out for, well, to the turn of the next century, they come to some conclusions that are really helpful in asking what comes next for us here at the bottom of the basin. The left-hand two panels are saying what would happen up through about the middle of the century. And the right-hand two panels are saying, what are we expecting in terms of what will happen from temperature increases in climate at the end of the century? And distilling all of that, don't try to understand what is really there. This is just a reference to the particular paper. Basically, we're somewhere probably between a 20 and a 40% decline in river flows looking out to the end of the century. And all I did is I have prorated that with a couple of scenarios and said, let's take what has historically happened from these headwater regions. And now I've crossed through that path and I actually am in the Green River Basin, and that water does make its way down to California. If there is a hotter future there, what are things going to look like all the way down the river as far as the naturalized flows after we take all of the human impacts out? Just a very quick schematic of the basin as a whole. Headwaters are primarily in Colorado and Wyoming, a little bit in the mountains of New Mexico as well. I'm not going to be including the Gila River Basin in this, except to the extent that water is exported into the Phoenix and Tucson area out of the Colorado. We have 7 states and right down to Mexicali in Mexico and the agricultural regions there. Typical years, there's no river when it hits the Gulf of California because it has been used 100%. At the end of the day, the modeling that I have done uses a very specific flow sequence historically, starting from 1918, moving up to 2014. I also want to contrast that with what is in. If you look in blue on the left-hand side, that is a historic sequence called the severe and sustained drought. That was the basis for a study about 25 years ago in the Colorado. And much of what I'm talking about today is actually a retrospective of that, saying what has changed in the last 25 years? What can we say now that we understand a little better what might be going on with climate? So you can see my 20 and 40% declines with the historic 20, historic 40. And I want to just point that at the end of what I have is a 97-year sequence. On from here to much, much lower flows potentially at the end. So I'm going to be working with a couple of different sequences as we go through here of somewhat less and a whole lot less water for the future. That's the publications that came out 25 years ago. Lots of research support from MET, water resources centers all over the place, USGS, lots of authors on those papers. I worked with Bonnie Colby at the University of Arizona on the basic data that went into the model that I developed at that time for this work. The schematic shows the level of detail that I provided in the hydroeconomic modeling that I developed, used at the time, which incorporates economic values at all of the rectangles that you see there, and routes water down through the major reservoirs in the basin, from the headwaters states right down to here. Importantly, it includes exports out to Denver, Colorado Front Range, and of course to here, as we're not in the Colorado River Basin here, but through the aqueduct, we get substantial amounts of water. Now it's 25 years later, and there's a new issue in JARA, Journal of American Water Resources Association, where we've looked again at what might this future look like. And so today I'm going to be talking about this more recent work and what I've concluded there. I've decided that that schematic that you saw before in that model is too much for me to deal with at my age. And so I've been working with the simplest possible model that you could have to answer some questions about the future that I think are important. One of them being, can we manage that reservoir that's right in the middle there to better serve the purposes that we want to get from water? Seems like a reasonable thing to do. And you are the downstream uses right here. The inflow on the top there is what I was doing all that fancy hydrology stuff about. We're going to put some rules in for that reservoir storage in the middle. I want you to look over to the right as well, where our inflow every year, it varies a whole lot. This is a really variable river basin. You know, living here, that sometimes it rains and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it even snows. I happened to be around here in February when it snowed. I felt lucky, I guess. So we have a lot of flow variability. The reservoir helps us carry out that. I shouldn't say the reservoir, a whole bunch of them. I have taken the two major ones, like Powell and Lake Mead, that are behind Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam, and I just make a mashup of them. They're one synthetic reservoir that I create for the purposes of the formal modeling that underlies the places that we're going with this. The evaporation that comes off of that is an important piece, because over the years you end up losing substantial amounts as, especially when they're full, as water evaporates, and therefore you can use it. You can no longer use it. But of course, you're dampening out that flow variability at the same time. Downstream is a whole bunch of agriculture and you. And I put an economic demand, a relationship between price and quantity there, and it's characterized most importantly by an elasticity. So this is the place where I want to connect those three pieces to what is actually going on in the governance of this basin at the moment. So we've got our states there. You can see the major rivers coming down. There are just a couple of things that you want to keep in mind about the institutions that talk about how water is allocated in this basin. We have the Colorado River Compact, which divides the waters between the upper basin, that's the darker shaded orange, and the lower basin, which you are in here. We have agreements within both the upper basin and the lower basin that allocate water within each of those. We have a treaty with Mexico that delivers about 10% of the annual flows of the river to Mexico. And that should be sort of all the basic starting point that we need. We have rules that say how this water, whether it is a lot or a little, gets allocated. You'll often hear that the Colorado is an over-allocated river. I would say it is not over-allocated at all because there are rules for who gets what, regardless of how much water there is. It is, however, most certainly an over-promised river. It's an oversubscribed river as well. Water is scarce in the basin. There is much more demand for it in an economic sense than there is an available supply. And that's simple, normal economic scarcity that we have for everything that we live with, whether it's land in the LA basin, or whether it is the education that you in both money and time are going through right now. Water is a very scarce commodity in the West. And so, of course, it's oversubscribed if there are just promises about how much you might get. But there are more than promises. There are allocation rules that say where it goes. So I say that the Colorado is an overpromised river, not an over-allocated river. Well, let's go to the math. There had to be some math here if there are economists involved. And it's nothing more or less than taking our idea of utility, of how much benefit one gets out of using a resource, in this case, the consumptive use of water that depletes it so nobody else can make use of it, and constraints that route water from one place to the other, and we want to get the maximum possible utility out of that one place that water is used in the way I set this up, which is below the reservoir. I code this all in something called GAMS, which is a standard way to do these things, and I usually solve it in either Minos or Cplex. Those are numerical mathematical routines that give solutions, not analytic solutions, but number solutions to mathematical models of this type. You'll note that the flow variability really shows up in the equation number 2 there. The evaporation shows up in that equation number 2 as well, with the loss part of that. And the elasticity is embedded within the utility function. This formulation of how to think about the river basin is something that I've been working with for a number of years now. And in a more abstract way, I took these 3 ideas of elasticity, flow variability, and the evaporation losses. And I looked at those 3 variables to try to map out what those trade-offs really were. I don't need to go through that at the moment here. I just want to move on to what that means for the Colorado moving ahead. Now, in order to sort of map this incredibly simplistic structure onto an incredibly complex system that I learned today has more surface area than Spain does, I needed to make these assumptions. This is actually only a model of the lower basin of the Colorado. If you look over decades and decades, the upper basin just uses up about 4 million acre feet. That number means about a quarter to a third, depending on how you're counting, of the water that is available, that naturally comes into the basin. And I just lop that off the top because that corresponds with the law of the river or the Colorado Compact in 1922 that on its surface says the upper basin gets to take a certain amount and they have to deliver some to the lower basin. Now, yes, I know that's a smaller amount than the compact says that the upper basin should be able to use, but the fact is that it's very difficult to develop new uses, and with climate change, there are many, many open questions about whether they ever will develop any more. History says it's been 4 for a long time. If you look at it, if you just go by year, no real trends up or down. My composite reservoir is Powell and Mead, and the Gila Basin isn't there. And I used an elasticity of minus 0.5, a little bit high for municipal use and a little bit low for agricultural use. One could imagine moving this around because I've lumped ag and mean, I've lumped everything together as a single user. And now I'm going to run it ahead to ask, can we manage those reservoirs in a way that help us do better than the status quo, than the way we're doing today? But I also want to answer the question, what is going to happen with those reservoirs looking ahead? Let's see. So on the left-hand side, you can think of that as today moving forward, but with the way things were in flows starting from 1918. And we're going to go ahead in time, 97 years with all of the droughts and big periods of water use we had. The solid line there is just the straight historical flows. And the dotted line and then the dashed are really 20% low and 40% low is about what those are. You'll note that the graph has all this room at the top. That's basically saying that we're not using up all of that reservoir storage that we have. At best, it looks like Powell and Mead are going to be about half full, except when they're almost empty and we've used them almost fully up. That's actually a lot the experience we've had in the last 20 years, because the last 20 years in many ways is a trial run for what normal will be looking forward. Of course, a bad drought looking forward is going to be a lot more severe than what we had to deal with in the last 20 years. Let's ask about water use now. Water use, this is the simplistic thing that we see coming out of the model. Water use goes down and down and down until a reservoir is exhausted, and then it sort of resets. A couple technical things. This is a dynamic model, meaning it's allocating water across years in an optimal fashion. And the results I'm showing here are from what I call a perfect foresight model, that through some miracle, we know what future flows are going to be. The real world doesn't have that. We don't know what future flows are. And so things I'm not going to show you put in what we actually do know about the future. It doesn't really change our conclusions very much to do that. So I'm just going with this sort of pure economic model here, even though it is unrealistic in so many of its dimensions. But we add reality in and we have the same basic kinds of conclusions. In particular, right there where I just drew that line, that is our typical historic use today in the lower basin. and anything below that is less, of course. If we have the really severe, 40% kinds of declines, and then we add a drought on top of it, which sort of happens at the end of the sequence, because it's sort of the first decade of this really bad drought we had in the last 2 decades, we lose an enormous amount right there. So there's some cause for some real concern there. Maybe we can, through managing the reservoirs in different ways, maybe we can mitigate that. The answer is no, we can't not mitigate that. Trying lots of different ways to manage the reservoir in saving water for the future, for the really bad droughts. The problem is that evaporation gets you in the end, and the best thing to do is to actually keep them fairly empty and deal with the consequences. So the different colors, what I have going on here, inflow on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is the release from the reservoir, which is identical to how much water gets used. So how much water can be used in this basin is exactly the same as how much comes in, except at higher levels where you see the blue diverging. And that simply means that the law of the river, which is blue, is a little bit conservative, and we could actually squeeze a little bit more out of this river than we actually do right now, believe it or not. That's what that conclusion says. But what's really relevant is looking at the lower levels. That says there's less room for public policy and for economics when it comes to reservoir management. And we need to pay a lot of attention to the hydrologists. If they say there's less water in the future, there's less we're going to use. And that's really what I care about as an economist and somebody who's interested in the institutional adjustments that we can make in the basin to cope with, to live with the increasing water scarcity that we will have in the future. So that's how I've answered these questions of, will the reservoirs be mostly empty? Yes, they will be in the future if we want to get the greatest possible benefits out of the Colorado in terms of consumptive use downstream of the end of the reservoirs anyway. What's a reasonable 100-year sequence if you're using historic sequences? I really like 1918 to 2014, and I'll make a lot of arguments about why that's a really nice sequence to use. And then you adjust it for climate. And yes, flows are going to decline. Don't know exactly how much, but our reservoirs are not going to mitigate this. The blue, how do we deal with this? I'm going to open this up for some discussion in a little bit. And the real core of what I do like to do is talk about choices that are ahead of us. Those choices are to deal with this. This is a measure of scarcity. This is the marginal utility or the shadow price or the value of the next drop of water that happens in that 97 years that we're looking at on the horizontal axis. And oh yeah, the number 1 here on the vertical axis that is way, way down. About there. That's the typical kind of scarcity that we have today. Under the case of 40% reductions and then a big drought on top of that, we have enormous values for the next drop. This isn't the average value of water. This is just the value of the next drop of it. All right. I'm actually not as pessimistic at all about what this says here. I mean, this suggests that, my God, water is going to be incredibly precious, that there, might even be a couple cents worth of water in this, whereas right now, this little water bottle here, I'm not sure what it is, maybe 1/1000th of a cent is what that's worth in there. What you would pay a water utility to get it. or if you're growing alfalfa, then it's a factor of 100 less than that perhaps. But just keep that in mind that if we don't have reasonable ways to cope with this, we could end up in some real hurt. Okay, I'm going to bring us back so that you just have the picture of where we're using things in the basin again now. So we are actually outside of the basin in the big metro area, LA, San Diego, and over here in Riverside, on the western side of the mountains, and up against the coast. Denver in the upper right, Albuquerque in the southeast here, over in the Rio Grande Basin, because there are exports over into there. Before we ask how we might cope with this, we should go beyond one single user and say a little bit about what we're actually going to use. There are a few people in the room who are working on some research papers right now for a journal called Choices. And this is really the core of what I'm hoping to do there. And I'm going to be talking with you about what these numbers actually should be, because I've just pulled most of these out of my experience. Some of them are backed up by actual research papers, but they're largely based on judgment. So don't take any of the numbers at face value here, but they are meant to be real in the sense that they're just not slapped up there as in an arbitrary way, except for the order. If you want to think of this as an economic supply curve, you typically start with the lowest value first, not one of the higher values. My quantities there are showing, well, one way of dealing with lower flows in the future is to say, well, let's somehow get more water here. The problem is not enough of something. Usually you build more. There are a few options here. There are a lot of areas, riparian areas, with a lot of invasive species that might evaporate a lot of water, and there might be some possibilities there in vegetation management to reduce the amount of water used there a little bit. Can we manage storage a little bit better than we do? So this is now from the status quo. This isn't from the model. Yeah, we can reduce evaporation. We could store a lot more water underground, or maybe we don't lose as much. Maybe we can store water for 20 years without losing any and have it available for those really bad times. Maybe we could store water now and have it available for the future, which is actually happening in the basin right now. A lot of this stuff is happening. We could reuse a whole lot more than we do right in the area here, where our wastewater largely goes out to the ocean right now and is lost. We could desalinate water. That's maybe the biggest opportunity that I see there, but it's pretty costly. And yeah, we could import water. You saw that big Knife Point Glacier. We could take some of that water from the east, from the North Platte system, and dump it in here. Or we could get water from the Snake River system and put it in. But we probably aren't going to go that direction in those things, but those are physically viable, and engineering-wise, it wouldn't be too hard to do a lot of these things. I'm including transaction costs in these, though. The studies that we would want to do beforehand, maybe a little bit of the opportunity costs and the environmental costs of it. I have a big range of prices here as well, and I want to use that to illustrate that there's some low-hanging fruit maybe. The middle is maybe what would be typical. The top is maybe the 90%, and there's even much more expensive stuff on top of that. It's an illustration. Don't take it too seriously. But there's some opportunities to generate more. The demand side is where most of the ways in which we're going to cope with things are, that we're going to use less. And this is giving us something about the ways in which we're going to use less. Again, I have ordered it in something of an arbitrary way. If you want to think of this as a demand curve, then you would put the highest value on the left and the lowest values on the right. If you wanted to think about demand reduction as a supply source, which is often done in discussions in the Colorado and other places. California as a whole often treats demand reductions as a future supply source. Just a matter of language, how you look at it. Then you would order it from the lowest on the left to the highest on the right. I've deliberately just not ordered it and not taken a stance. I view these as just, this is the cost of these various opportunities, if you will. We could live with less in our municipal and commercial and industrial uses. We could use less in agriculture. Note that the quantities are sort of real for the basin here, that there are millions of acre feet of water use that happen with relatively low valued crops. Much less in municipal and industrial. And there are some very high valued crops. And then there's some sort of management kinds of things we could think about as well. Higher efficiency, though largely efficiency just means that you get the water and somebody downstream doesn't get it. Interruptible water or water leases from municipal entities to agricultural districts that are interrupted in times of drought. Maybe that's a way of managing things in a less costly way. It's useful to put these together on the same scale because I didn't have the same scale. The supply opportunities, if you will, are pretty high cost and don't extend to very much water compared to what's going on the demand side. So water use reductions are what are in our future one way or the other. That's really the take-home message here. You need to have this picture, and this is just another way of showing what that previous slide was, that in the Colorado River Basin, as in most Western states and in most semi-arid or arid regions of the entire world, most water is used by irrigated agriculture and everything else is small by comparison. So I like to think just round figures, 3/4 is irrigated agriculture, something less than 1/4 is municipal, commercial, and industrial, and there's a not insignificant component, which is evaporation that I like to think of as something on the order of 10%. Danielle, that's the 1.5 million acre feet that you were talking about earlier, 10% of 15 million acre feet. Very round figures for how much is available in this basin. Now the fun part. Scenarios and choices in a drier future. I'm going to put up about 5 of them, and I want you to be thinking about what you want to say and ask about each one of those. Because I think of the future as being a portfolio of choices that we make in order to live with those lower flows that we're going to have. As economists, we always want to benchmark what the lowest economic damages, if you want to look at it, from less water would be, or the way to maximize the benefits that we get from a given amount. Just depends on your baseline, which way you want to talk about that. Okay, what's the economically efficient way to go about this? How about an abundance scenario? Say we want to take advantage of all the supply opportunities that are there. How could we live with abundance in the future rather than having to live with more and more and more scarcity? Water efficiency is often talked about as the way to get ourselves out of the problem of declining natural flows and water waste. What could we do under that? Are there things we can do with financial engineering to provide additional insurance for crops, to make better use of leases between municipal water districts and agricultural districts? And finally, water pricing is always used to put the opportunity cost of water use right in the face of all water users. What might that look like in practice? What institutions could you put in place? You can certainly paint a scenario of using water pricing that would lead to something like the competitive market ideal of how goods and services can be managed in an economy that magically leads to an efficient outcome so that this bottom one becomes exactly the same as the top one. So I'm mixing up policies and outcomes here. I want to know your thoughts and your questions, though, about what scenarios you might want to both look at, but what you might include under these categories right here as well. While you're thinking about that right now, I'm actually using you as an idea piece for this paper that's coming, because I want to take those previous graphs and I want to just make these things happen using those previous graphs. There's no optimization involved. It's a choose one from here, choose one from here, choose one from here. Let's see what it says. What should be in these? Or what are there any of these that you want me to elaborate on in more detail on what could be there? Yes.
By water efficiency, do you mean like different systems of irrigation that use water in a way that has less waste?
That's a great question, and that could be part of it. In addition to different kinds of irrigation systems, whether we're talking drip, sprinkler, I'm also thinking maybe we do something like put solar cells on top of a management lake or reservoir, something that goes up and down, is really shallow. It's not a lot of water, but we cover it so it doesn't evaporate as much. That would be a kind of efficiency. So I'm mixing efficiency in consumptive use and in return flows right here. It's a very dangerous thing to do, but it's the way things are actually talked about. So I put it there. So one is the very commonplace, which you brought up, and I gave you an example of an out there thing. Lining ditches, concrete lining of ditches would be another example, but usually that just means that the irrigation district that did that has more available to them, and whoever used the groundwater that came from the seepage doesn't get that anymore. It was a big issue with the All-American Canal and Mexican irrigators about 5 or 10 years ago.
Thank you for that response, Professor. We do have a question from Zoom. They're asking, have you tried also demand elasticities that are different from the 0.5 for all user? Do you think that having one elasticity for all sectors and locations is realistic?
Having one for all sectors,
yeah,
one to represent everybody is certainly not realistic, and I would have to add different sectors if I wanted to be more realistic there. For the particular conclusion on the reservoir management not being that important, I have not gone to even more inelastic demand, which would be the way in which you would get more effective reservoir management. Seems I'm already out there on, there's a lot of flexibility at minus 0.5 on the elasticity. So, but I haven't done a broader sensitivity analysis.
Thank you.
I think in future in climate change, and the first idea that comes to my mind is uncertainty. That we don't know what is going on with not with only climate change, right, but only with weather condition, with the next 2 years, 3 years, and we expect that with climate change we will have long periods with intense droughts and extreme events in the basin, right? And here you point out something that is financial engineering, right? In that, how do you think that we can help to have, I don't know, a future, a market of future right of water to deal with water scarcity in the basin?
Yeah. That's a great question. Another thing that I've totally swept under the rug here is sort of long run versus short run issues. And with financial engineering, I view that as a short to medium run thing. You're exactly right that there's nothing that financial engineering is going to do if the mean level is lowered. You're just going to have to adjust to that lower mean level. It's a little bit like reservoir management, actually. One is physical management of variability, and the other is managing that through financial instruments. I'd say their elasticity is in there too, that you can have a greater elasticity, which allows you not to have to do so much on the physical end if you are providing financial support through financial engineering, insurance kinds of products.
Also elaborate on the environmental water use, which I didn't see much in the slides, and also some of the new users like tribes, and they have the right, but they haven't used it as much.
Yeah, I'm going to keep all of this up here at the moment. So there are a number of uses that are not represented here, some of which we might call new or not yet implemented. And I'm not sure technically how to represent this, but we might look at, we most certainly have demands right now that don't have any standing in the basin, like many of the environmental and ecological benefits that would come from putting water to that use. An obvious environmental one would be to have more water going into the Salton Sea. That's also under my imports here, is bringing some kind of salt water perhaps into the Salton Sea, or though when we say that the basin is over promised, we haven't left anything for the environment. We haven't left anything for, in some cases, native uses, though that is promised but not yet delivered in many cases, though in other cases it is delivered, because we do have a number of Colorado River Indian rights that are being used right along the river itself in Arizona and California. So it's a mixed situation right there. Some of those are represented here and some of them are not. So I'd like to talk later, though, about how to incorporate those more explicitly in this framework that is here, because that's a real shortcoming in this kind of presentation, that environmental and tribal rights that do not have, that aren't being satisfied in any way at the moment. And you could look at those as new demands, they just don't show up here.
I have a technical question. What are the terminal condition of the dams?
Terminal condition, after 97 years, they have to have the same amount of storage they started with.
Did you make some kind of sensitivity analysis of?
I didn't, because I have such a long time frame that it really isn't going to matter much over that much time. It's the joy of a very small model, is that you can run it for many, many years, or maybe 3 generations.
Last question from you. When there is reductions in the flow, also there are going to be some water quality issues. Have you looked at that, or you have thoughts on that? More saline water.
Right. My thoughts on water quality, which in the basin here really is the salts in the water that cause damages to both crops and to our uses in dishwashers, washing machines, and so forth here in municipal use. What I found in previous work is that most of that those damages are roughly similar to the benefits of hydropower as well, which go down as we have less and less water. So that's sort of the order of magnitude on those. But I don't have those explicitly in here as well, in this formal work at all. But there certainly are some added costs there.
How did you incorporate to the model the change that the fact that we will expect more evapotranspiration of floods and also population growth?
So this is where quite a lot of sensitivity analysis could happen. Formally in the model here, I have not a discounting, but a preference for actually, I do have a kind of discounting for present use that is right in the evaporative loss. What you're saying is that the demand should be growing over time. So the evaporative loss, discounting the future, what happens in the future at some kind of social discount rate, rate of time preference, rising demands, those are all linked together. And the short answer is I don't do any discounting, and I think of the discounting you might do as being just about at the same rate that you might have population growth. I've actually got a parameter in the model set to 0 to represent both of those. They sort of, I think they're probably pretty close to straight trade-off.
Yeah, I have a question on elasticity. So current consensus is municipal elasticity for municipal water use is inflexible compared to agricultural sector, because agricultural sector can have a variable water use. But now the shift in perennial crops will change that elasticity for agricultural uses. So have you considered that into your model, that now agricultural use is also inflexible? Thank you.
So that is how you would have to model this to understand where it would be economically optimal to move between the move water between the sectors here. That the relative elasticities, which cannot be represented in any way that I can understand with one user, you just need to expand to that. So I'm really using the one model, the single user, as a thought experiment. It's a use of a model to answer some very specific questions. And I'm going to go to the very end here on these very specific questions that are really what I wanted to get at. I'm sorry about this. I wanted to get at just what are the biggest macro impacts in the basin as a whole. I am not so concerned right now about specifically where that water use reduction is going to come. Specifically where it comes from is related to both the value in current use and the elasticity for when that use changes. Because we have such high transaction costs, it is so unclear with the institutions on how things might evolve in the future. I'm skeptical that just doing the straight economic optimization is going to give us the full solution space, to use technical terms, the full set of alternatives that are reasonable to consider for the future. I think there's a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit here, tremendous amount of ways to accomplish the use reductions that are inevitable for the future, and was the purpose of the formal model that I've got right now, which is really to say, yeah, we can't engineer our way out of this, whether it is physical engineering or whether it is financial engineering. there's gonna be less and we're gonna have to live with it. Now, let's look at some scenarios that have maybe reasonably low cost, but reasonably high probability of getting agreements between stakeholders. That's the purpose of those blue bar graphs I had, is to say, maybe we can pick and choose from some of these alternatives. So it's a very different way of looking at it than formally using a hydroeconomic model to say, this is what would be optimal.
Questions in the Zoom? No.
Let me say just a little bit more on the very bottom, two bullets here. Over the last 20 years, we've had this significant drought, and the institutions which govern the Colorado have had many changes in the way that many ways that they've accommodated that drought. When I was first working on this, the idea of water moving from one state to the other, because the law of the river really allocates water by state, was something that just wasn't considered. Each state had their allocation by rule, and one wasn't going to sell it or borrow it or anything like that from the other. And now you have Nevada that is banking water in the aquifers of Arizona. California is involved in that in some ways that I don't quite understand yet as well. There are cracks around the edges as well. There are drought contingency plans that have said, as the reservoirs get lower and lower, we really are going to implement cutbacks in a particular way. Those rules weren't in place 20 years ago. And beyond that, we're seeing just continual evolution, I think, in how those institutions operate. It's very slow. It will occur over generations, but climate, we're not going to have a 40% reduction in flows tomorrow either, unless there's another drought that happens 5 years from now and is really horrendous. And I have great optimism that crises allow institutions to adapt. I have great optimism that there are other parts of the country that can take up the agriculture that might not be produced in the Southwest anymore. Perhaps having lived in New York and the Northeast, I see lots of agriculture that used to exist there that doesn't exist anymore because there's a tremendous absolute advantage in crop production here when there's water. But you add really, really scarce water and suddenly the comparative advantage might shift to other parts of the country. Other than vegetables, there really isn't a lot produced here relative to the rest of the country. And oh yeah, vegetables can be produced in greenhouses. Northern Europe produces most of its vegetables in greenhouses. And I haven't noticed that there are enormous economic disruptions that happen in Northern Europe because of lack of water. Even though it does make the news when barges can't get down the Rhine, just like we have trouble with barges getting down the Mississippi here. There are adaptations that have to be made, absolutely, but I'm optimistic that over periods of many decades that we have the capacity to do that. So that is a great place to end. I'd be very happy to stay after for as long as the room and your interest is here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Booker, for joining us today for the water seminar. We greatly appreciate your time. Thank you to our audience members as well for coming out and being with us today. We hope that you join us for future School of Public Policy events. Tomorrow, Thursday, November 16th, we'll have a seminar on creating common ground and breaking filter bubbles. Wednesday, November 29th, we'll host a seminar by General Barry Price on considering a career in international public service. Additionally, stay tuned for our next water seminar. You can learn more about events like these hosted by the UCR School of Public Policy by visiting our website at spp.ucr.edu. And while you're there, you can also learn about our Master of Public Policy Program and our newly launched EA and BP program. Additionally, you can listen to or watch our official podcast series, Policy Chats. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to get some refreshments and some cookies at the table, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Good luck. LAX. Feel free to be in touch anytime. Shoot me an email. Absolutely. I need your data on values desperately. Right. Very good.
Amazing.
Yes, the water quality. Yeah, no, there's a cost there with this.
Right.
Yeah.
Say thank you to everybody who set this up
Yes.
right here.
Thank you very much.
And to
Hi, Professor, nice to meet you. My name is Miriam. Thank you for coming out.
put out a great seminar
Yeah, thank you for bringing
environment here.
awareness to it. A lot of times we can't see a problem. We just kind of don't think it exists. So, thank you. Yeah, it's very informative. This is a
Let's go.
Thank you for this. I just found it interesting, my family, we were talking about it, recently. My grandmother, owns land over there, and they got it, so,
Oh, okay.
they were talking about like the concrete, I never knew like why they have like the concrete irrigation systems. And like, I guess a big thing over there, I know, is like the leasing that people are renting other people's land, so that
Sure.
they get access to the
Yeah, it
water.
doesn't matter what side of the border you are, leasing is a huge thing from one farmer to another.
Thank you so much. Good job.